everyone. So this is part 2 of agriculture. So the syllabus, I had this split up over 2 days, and I'm glad I did, because even though I made those comments on the last one, like, oh, this won't be so long, it ended up still being like close to an hour. So so good thing I did make it split it up into 2. I had a feeling. Okay, so we're just going to continue right on with the second part. And my eye. Pretty sure we left off on slide 15. This was just 2 days ago. How did I forget already? Slide 15, almost positive. Oh yeah, because I remember. Okay, so I remember the last thing I talked about on the previous video was how we know from the research that around 10,000, give or take, years ago, many populations around the world transitioned to large scale agriculture, and also at that same time there were massive population increases. And so we know these two things kind of go hand in hand, but we don't really know which one caused which. And I know I said this in the last video, that if you say, you think, okay, maybe it was agriculture that came first. So agriculture came first, and people and populations increased because of that, because now suddenly you could have large amounts of food, you could store large amounts of food, so you could feed more people, which meant that your offspring would be more likely to survive, and then populations increased after that. But then the question still remains, why was there a transition to agriculture? And then on the reverse of that, if large populations happened, then it would make sense that many populations or many groups around the world would transition to a type of subsistence where they could feed more individuals. Okay, but it's still the unanswered question of why did populations increase? So it's I'll tell you right now, we don't know. We just know that these two things happened at the same time, and we're not really sure which one came first or why, or there's another factor we just aren't aware of. So keep that in mind. And then the pros and cons. So I started to get into this. I'm still on slide 15. I'm making sure I didn't forget anything. So this might have been. Did I end on the slide, or did we start on? It doesn't matter. I'm talking about it. Okay. So. The pros and cons. So, I did talk about oh my god, I don't even remember. I mean, I remember, but I'm not sure to what detail. Okay. I know, I think I did talk about this, about how, yeah. So if you're a hunter or gatherer, you are reliant on nature, so it's less work that you have to put in terms of the large space that you have to clear, the different technologies that you might need to have for large scale agriculture. But you're still putting it into work every day. It's just a different type of work. So, but it is a bit different, and nature is providing a lot. But then, of course, if you are relying on nature, what if there's a drought or something? So that's pros and cons to being a hunter gatherer. Also, hunter gatherer, you have a more varied diet, a healthier diet. So that's obviously a plus. Not so much with agriculture. In fact, there are many diseases we call diseases of agriculture, or diseases of modernity, because of this. And I know I mentioned this last time, something called a mono diet. So a lot of early agricultural societies, and even some recent ones, what we see is that these groups might be able to grow a large amount of crop, but it's often one or two, or only a few different types of food. And so you might have an abundance of a certain type of food, but if you're only eating that food, you're going to miss out on nutrients that you're not getting because you're only eating a few types of food. Versus as a hunter-gatherer, when you're living off nature, you're going to get all these amazing and varied nutrients from the different foods that you're eating. So pros and cons. Let's go to slide 16. So I kind of already said this, that first bullet point, mono diet, so I said what that was. Also, we see dental caries. Another way of saying that is a cavity, so you guys are all familiar with that. We see these when there's an increase in carbohydrates. So obviously we know there are sugars in fruit and stuff, but it's not to the same degree the dental caries aren't to the same degree that we see when we see agriculture. There's a significant increase. So you can imagine if you're eating, starches all the time, in like, with different, like, let's say like wheat, for example. Like, and that's one of those things when we think, oh, I need to like eliminate carbohydrates from my diet. We think, oh, like sugar. We don't think of things like pasta and stuff, And like, I mean, there's the whole discussion we could get into about, simple versus complex, but it's still a thing. Like, we know that cavities absolutely increased around this time. Now you might be thinking, like, so what? Like, a cavity, who cares? But for you, like, say you have a toothache, really bad toothache, you go to the dentist, right? And they take care of it. You get a filling, or they have to extract the tooth. If there's an infection, they write you a really quick prescription for antibiotics. And she's like digging for something back there. Waffle. Okay. She literally was just napping all afternoon, and then every time I go to do video, she's got to be doing something. Okay. What was I saying? Dentist. So if you had a toothache, you would just go to the dentist, right? It's a pretty simple thing. But imagine you are living in a time where there are no dentists, and you get a cavity, and which leads to an infection. You can, and if you don't get any medical treatment, you will die from that infection if it gets into your bloodstream and you go septic. So actually, as a side note, I had a friend. This was probably like 20 years ago. But her brother had a toothache. And we were young. Like, I think he was maybe 20, maybe something like that. He had a toothache, and it got really, really bad. And he, like many people, had a fear of going to the dentist, and so he didn't go. And suddenly he just was really sick, and he had to be rushed to the ER. And he ended up having this, really bad cavity that turned into an abscess in his gums, and it got infected, and it got into his bloodstream, and he died, all because of that. Now, that, of course, doesn't happen every single time, but it absolutely can happen. We don't really see that in let's say the United States, for example. It's very rare, because we have access to medical professionals and dental professionals. But so, like I said, imagine a time in our past where suddenly you're getting these things, and yeah, maybe we start seeing extractions, but it's definitely going to be a problem, and can be a fatal problem. The next bullet point I have is obesity. Hey, what are you doing? Obesity. So we see this increase with agriculture, and of course all of the different health concerns that accompany obesity. Heart disease, diabetes, other things, joint problems. So we see a huge transition in the health of humans once we have agriculture. And also I wanted to point out that this kind of goes along with the pros and cons too, is that with agriculture now, people are settled. They're settled in certain areas. They're not. I know I mentioned this in the previous PowerPoint, but they're not nomadic or semi-nomadic. They are settled for their whole lives, often in the same location and for generations, because now they've built their lives around a large piece of land that they're going to get food from. So now we have more permanent structures. I think I mentioned this last time. We get to see more culturally, like, artistic expression in terms of like statues, like more permanent art. So like culturally it's very interesting. So this huge interesting transition, with the changes in one aspect of a human life, or in a cultural experience, will often affect the other cultural experiences. There's something else I was going to say. Yeah. But that was the point. Because we're settled in certain areas, we're also less, there's a term, we're more sedentary. Hi, I know you're up to something. What are you doing? Okay. She's like, Mom. We're more sedentary. So obviously people are still, working the land, but now you have to think about how the dynamic within the community has changed. that it's not everyone who's doing that. So suddenly if you have now a larger population, you have certain people who have like, that's their dedicated responsibility, like they're the ones who grow the food. But then you have other people who like process the food. And then you have other people who aren't even involved in the food process now because you have other aspects to your community that you didn't have before. So maybe you have a person who's in charge of, building the structures, and someone else who maybe who's in charge of like, I don't know. You guys can just imagine like the jobs and responsibilities within a community are going to drastically change when you move from small group to big group, and hunting and gathering and agriculture. And also, and I forgot what I was going to say. I kind of already said it, but I'll kind of just say it in a different way. But now there's a little bit of a debate about this, but this seems to be what's accurate in terms of like what the archaeology is showing, is that with agriculture and individuals and communities being more sedentary, while they clearly still have jobs and tasks that they have to do in the community, there is a lot more free time. Like I said, this is still kind of debated whether there really was more free time for agricultural groups versus hunter-gatherer groups, but it seems as if there's probably a little bit more. And so we start to see, like I said, a lot more art and stuff. Like we have more time for symbolic expression. You're not spending your entire day, gathering food, and especially if you're living in a large population where that's not even part of your responsibility. And then think about it in terms of like even like Las Vegas, that we once you're an adult, and sometimes even before you're an adult, you have a job, and you in some way are you have a responsibility in the community first. Like you get a paycheck, but you still have a responsibility in the community in some way, and it might be related to providing food at some level, but it might not be at all. You might have a completely different job. And so whether we're talking about these early agricultural groups or even looking at like a modern population like Las Vegas in 2020, you can see how drastically things change. Like I said, when you have the access to food, you don't have to be directly involved in your food process, that you can just buy it from someone or trade with someone for it. And our lives are a lot more sedentary. So like keep some of these ideas in your mind as we kind of go through this and some of the other PowerPoints. And then of course that last question, if we were in class, I would ask you like, what are other health problems associated with agriculture? And maybe you would think of some. Okay, so let's go on to slide 17. So also with some other changes we see with agriculture is, obviously people are settled, so we start to see this concept of like owning land in terms of private property. It's not as if people didn't understand the concept of like this land is like this belong to this group or that group, or maybe even when you're nomadic or semi-nomadic, you still have areas that you use. So like that's still a thing. But now just that idea has kind of expanded in what it means for a lot of these populations earlier on, and of course even now that we have more conceptual ideas about land and land use. Let's see, slide 18. And like I said before, some of the pros and cons of agriculture, that now obviously we can support a lot of people with the amount of food, and but there's also sexual stratification. So it's not, so I want to make this clear. In hunter-gatherer societies, there is a sexual division of labor. Males tend to do certain things, females tend to do other things. And I think at the end of this PowerPoint, I'll talk about this just a little bit. But we see that for hunter-gatherer groups, we see that for agricultural groups. The difference is because hunter-gatherer groups, foragers, tend to be egalitarian, that even if you're a male doing one job or a female doing another job, all of the jobs, all the tasks, all the responsibilities in the community are often deemed to be like of equal importance to a degree. Like no one is more or less because of their sex or because of the job that they're doing. There's that equity amongst whether you're old, young, male, female, doesn't really matter. Of course, there's going to be some variation in that. But so like the sexual division of labor doesn't necessarily imply a power imbalance. Now we could get into some really complex feminist theory and say, well, it always does. And I would say like in a more advanced course, we could have some really cool conversations about that. But for this class, this is generally true, that what we see is that in hunter-gatherer groups, there is a sexual division of labor. Males tend to do one thing, females tend to do another. Ooh, oh my goodness, naughty girl. Okay. all sick in this house. Okay. But in terms of like contrasting that with agriculture, we see so there's still often a sexual division of labor, but now we have what's called stratification, that certain tasks are deemed more important, others are deemed less important. We start to see inequality in like class stratification too, because you're going to have those who have access to the food and those who do not, and like the whole system starts to change. So this is when we really start to see like inequalities at multiple levels within populations as we become more settled and our populations become larger. And then also I wanted to point out some of like the different types of agriculture as well. So like whether we're talking about 10,000 years ago or now, there are different types depending on the environment that you live in, depending on the crop that you're growing, and the types of storage that you have. You can see in some of these pictures the types of storage that you have will be different, smaller, bigger, depending on your population, of course, and also depending on the crop, how much you can put on reserve and for how long will obviously be dependent on the crop too. So a lot more technology is going into that. Slide 19. So like I said, so agricultural revolution about 10,000 years ago, and we do know that it began in this area called the Fertile Crescent. So you can see this on the map. There's areas of like modern day like Egypt and Lebanon and Israel and some other countries, some other areas. But we do know that it did kind of pop up in different parts of the world around the same time, which is also interesting. Like, was there enough contact, even at 10,000 years ago with migration, for there to be this, mass transition at different parts of the globe? So it's very interesting in areas where you wouldn't think it would happen. So like this is also like a point of research, like why did this happen, and like I said before with some of these other bullet points, we start to see like more permanent structures, more architecture, more permanent forms of art. We have this is when we see writing systems. So like I said before, there tends to be more of this like free time, and so you can these populations can create new avenues of their cultural experience that are really interesting. And this is the other thing, this second to last one, political structure or like bureaucracy. So imagine you live in a small group of like say 50 people, 50. You could probably all agree, like amongst like you were in a group of 50, like all 50 people could probably agree, okay, who's kind of the person who's kind of in charge of maybe the hunting expedition this week, who's in charge of the gathering for this season, who's gonna do some of the infant caretaking for the afternoon. Like a lot of those decisions you could probably just make, like everyone's kind of can agree very easily, and probably you could all stand there in a group of 50 and talk about it. When suddenly you go from 50 people to like 50,000, you can't do that anymore. You have to delegate a lot of this, and people don't really know who's who at these different points like in that structure. So you might have someone who's like in charge of like let's say let me think of like there's so many levels, but like take like 2020 Las Vegas. Think of all the different things that the state has incorporated and is kind of in charge of in terms of who we are and what we need access to as citizens. So like the first thing that always comes to my mind is like the DMV, but like there are so many different other things like the court system, even at the university system. You probably are aware of this. That there's just so many like levels to accessing and providing resources, whether it's education, whether it's food, whether it's state mandated licenses, like what I mean, like there's all this other shit that you need to be a functioning adult in the society that you need to have, and the levels at which like you have to access or that they are provided, like it's very impersonal. And but you have to have a system like this because there's just so many people. You can't just have all like say 50,000 people, or in the city of Vegas where we have like, oh man, I should know this. Like the greater Las Vegas area, isn't it like 2 million? I don't know. let's Google that right now. Because I'm guessing, I feel like I'm guessing right, but let's see. Okay, now, okay. Las Vegas population. Okay, this has it at like 700,000, but I feel like that's maybe just in. Oh yeah, so okay, if we include Las Vegas and Henderson, it's like 1 million. Okay, I said 2 million. I was way off. I thought it was for sure over 1 million. Huh. Okay, it's 1 million. Now you guys know it's like just around 1 million according to Google. Yeah, but so like the same thing. So imagine there were 1 million people. We can't all stand in a group and decide like how we're going to distribute the food and who's going to be in charge of this and who's going to be in charge of that and who's going to get the education and who's not and who's going to teach and who's going to be the student. Oh my God, like, can you imagine? Like, there's just no way. You have to be able to, there has to be a system in place to do that. And also, like, this is along these same lines, like in a group of 50, you don't really need to designate certain people as like the main person in charge. When your group starts getting a little bigger, then maybe you do. But with like 30 or 50 people, you're like, yeah, like maybe you have like people who are kind of natural leaders in the group, and people who, you know, like that's the best, you know, the best person to, what am I blanking? Oh, hey, that knows how to make a certain tool. So you might depend, like you might know where the natural talent is, the natural leaders, but you don't have to really designate certain people like one person in charge, because you're like, well, we can all just like take a vote, right? Or we all kind of agree, or I'm just going to go do my thing, you know. But when you have a group of like 50,000 or 1 million like the city, we can't do that. There has to be a system to say, okay, this is what's happening, so everyone's kind of, you know, understands. So there's like cohesion, and there is like civility in all of it. So like you can imagine just by population size alone, things drastically change in the bureaucratical system, but also think about how that changes your cultural experience in that system. It's just, it really alters it just by population alone, population size alone. I told you this before, population size is a huge, important factor. Okay, slide 20, industrialization. So like now we would say like we're agricultural society, but we'd say more it's like an industrialized agricultural society. So now we have like, the technology that we use is much more complex, more mechanical often. And so I have some examples of like we might use, you know, like tractors and stuff for like these large areas of land. Even we use like water and wind. But also, and I think I mentioned this before, now we have a very globalized world. So now we can, not only can we grow food and we have access to food that can be stored and we can feed everyone with it. But now we have access to food from all around the world. Like you can get, you know, food from South America and food from Asia and food from across your own country. Like, you know, I mean, you're not doing it. There's a system built to provide that to you. So now, like, and pros and cons to that, right? Because now with this very industrialized food system, we have access to all these amazing foods, healthy foods. We have access to a more varied diet, so we could walk into your local supermarket and get every nutrient that you would need to have a healthy life in just the produce section alone, 99% of it. But definitely in the whole entire like grocery store, it's not a problem, you know. So this is obviously like a benefit. But then think about how it's kind of gone, you know, kind of too far in that direction, and that a lot of our food is very processed. And so we're starting to see it's actually more unhealthy because we have these, you know, very quick, efficient ways of making food, like fast food or packaged food. And it's quick, it's easy, it's cheap, but it's not healthy. And that's like no surprise to anyone, right? That it's not healthy. Like, this has never changed. Like the more whole foods that you eat, the more fresh foods that you eat, it's going to be healthier for you. Hi, baby. What is up with you right now? What are you looking for? Okay, give me a minute and I'll help you, okay? She probably lost her baby. Wonder, like, she got like 10 out right now. Probably lost her favorite one or something. Okay. Just a couple more slides, okay? Okay, slide 21. Okay, so this is a point that I really wish we could have a class discussion on this, because when I've taught this class before, we always end up having a really lively, great class discussion on this about GMOs, how we would define, how they're defined, how we as individuals understand what that means, to what degree, healthy, not healthy, and then of course all of the other stuff that goes along with like the different companies involved. And so it's usually a fairly lively discussion. In fact, I would say, you know what? I'm gonna give you guys some extra credit. I'm not gonna post an announcement, so only those of you who are watching this video right now will get, you know, the secret extra credit. So why don't, if you want like totally extra credit, you don't have to. If you want, let's say we'll do how about up to 5 points extra credit, and just send me in either Canvas messaging or see as an email a short paragraph on GMOs. Maybe, let's say, give me like at least one pro and at least one con. I think that's good. Okay, like I said, completely extra credit. I won't put an announcement out, so I want to see how many of these I get. Maybe that'll be very telling of how many of you actually watch these videos. We'll say that. So 5 points extra credit. You know, a short paragraph talking about GMOs. Give me like one pro and one con, and I'll be interested to see your guys' take on that. Okay. So slide 22. Okay, so there are two really great kind of short videos here. Obviously, I'm not going to watch them. You can watch them. They're both really good. There's one about the health implications of living in a very industrialized economy with food and factory farming, and how and the health implications. And then there's one about the environmental implications. And this is another thing, is that I see I know I mentioned this to you guys before, that I'm vegan. So I'm a Gen Xer, and my generation globally, there's about 5% of us, maybe it's a little higher now, who are vegan or vegetarian. But for millennials globally, it's something like 13 or 14%. And that was when I checked it like in 2018. It's probably higher now. I see like a lot of people transitioning or having maybe like a huge portion of their diet is vegan or vegetarian. I think a lot of millennials are realizing, because with obviously like our knowledge of climate change and global warming, that factory farming is like the leading cause. And so I'm seeing people making this decision, like obviously as their personal, what's the one I'm thinking of? I can't think of the word, but the personal choice that they can make to help, you know, in terms of like I said, global warming, climate change, that going vegan is like a huge oh my god, I'm blanking on words right now. A huge help. There's another word for it. In fact, that reminds me actually of a really good documentary on Netflix. So I know like you guys have the opportunity for extra credit. I mentioned this, like it's in the syllabus, that if you come across any documentaries like on YouTube or Netflix or Hulu or whatever, and you want to write about it for extra credit, just send me the name and I'll say like yes or no. And then the instructions for writing up for a documentary, the instructions for writing up a documentary extra credit are in the syllabus. It's pretty straightforward, but it's in the syllabus. But there is one I just thought of right now that if you were interested, you're like, oh, I wouldn't mind some extra credit. And it's a really good documentary. It's called The Game Changers. It's on Netflix, and it's about plant-based diet, and they do these interviews with elite athletes, and they talk about the health implications and some of the new research that's coming out in terms of like eating plant-based, and these it's really interesting. So you could see some of like the health implications, but they definitely go into some of the other implications as well. But like I said, so when we think about the pros and cons of moving into like an agricultural society, industrialized, globalized economy, that and even that compared to like hunter-gatherer, doesn't matter. There's always going to be pros and cons. There's going to be good and bad with any of it. And so it's like, how do we, you know, have a balance with that? Okay, so slide 23. Division of labor. So like I said, we're going to always see division of labor, like sexual division of labor, but sometimes it's age, specialization, or even if you have a, sometimes we see like very specific like labor specialization depending on the economy, or depending on like the population, or I guess economy too. Okay, so go to slide 4. So if we're talking about hunting and gathering, or even at, like agricultural societies, industrial societies, it really doesn't matter. Like I said, we tend to see in general, these are true, that there is a sexual division of labor. Males tend to do one thing, females tend to do another, and so this is associated with sex, either sex. And so you can see on the PowerPoint with the bullet points, whether we're talking about hunting and gathering, or something horticulture or agriculture, that we're going to see these general trends. Like females would tend to be the ones who gather. Often misconception that in hunter-gatherer societies women aren't hunting. They absolutely do. In fact, they tend to catch more animals when they hunt, because usually they're hunting the smaller animals. So but not the large game. That they do sometimes, but it's more rare. They tend to be in charge of like the food preparation, and of course caring for the offspring. And I want to make a point about this, that this is really important, the caring for offspring. Think about human females as primates, as mammals. They are, they spend 9 months, give or take, actually gestating a fetus and growing it. So there's like that personal like energy and time and care that goes into that. But then there are, months afterward where the infant and mother are literally attached to each other in terms of breastfeeding. So you can imagine if you, as a female human, now have offspring, an infant, maybe even 1 or 2 that are small, and one is often attached literally to your body, it makes it a lot more difficult to be able to be gone for long periods of time. You would be able to carry, let's say, like a crying infant to go hunting. So it's not really that. I'll say it's not that females don't have the capability. In fact, we see that they often do. It's because that there are other responsibilities that are going on when you have what's called a natural fertility population. So a group that doesn't have access to like birth control. Now, of course, we know like for tens of thousands of years, people have understood how to use like natural remedies in terms of like to induce miscarriage or for pregnancy prevention, but not to the same degree that we know that we have now, like with like the birth control pill and stuff like that. So it's definitely a big difference in that. But when you have a natural fertility population, if you are a human female, then obviously there are going to be other factors that are going to dictate how and where and when you get food. If it's going to be large game, often not. Small game and plants that are located near your temporary living location. So it's almost always about the offspring care. But like I said before, it's the females who are feeding the community every day, 90% of the time, because for the meat that any of the men are bringing back, it tends to be they're not successful every time they go hunting, and they definitely don't hunt every day. So there's going to be obviously some variation in that depending on the population and depending on when, like historically, we're thinking. But and then of course we see in general, males are the ones who do the hunting, but also they tend to be the ones who are building the structures. So like this should make sense to you, because we know humans are sexually dimorphic. We are a sexually dimorphic species. Human males compared to human females in the same population tend to have much more upper body strength. This is just like biology and anatomy. It's how it works. Like males tend to have more upper body strength, but like other things that females have, like this is all like evolutionary. Females tend to have like better hand-eye coordination and balance. Like the list goes on. But in terms of just like sheer how much can you lift with your arms, males will almost always, as a group, do better at that than females, and females who do better as a group at other things, than males for sure. So we see, because of our bodies, because of our sex, how we are sexually dimorphic in terms of reproduction or body structure, that there are going to be certain jobs that just make sense. Now, that being said, unfortunately, what we end up doing culturally is we pile on a bunch of value judgment to that. Okay, this group is the one caring for the offspring and breastfeeding, facts. This other group tends to be the one building structures and lifting heavy stuff and hunting, fact. There's no judgment or like value judgment placed on that, but like innately. But we as a society, not me, but you know what I mean, like culturally, different cultures, historically and many that are existing now, like we place a value on one being more or less important than another. And what we see is often, not 100% of the time, but more often than not, it's typically the female role that is deemed to be not as important or not as valuable, and the male role that's deemed to be more important, more valuable. And of course, I'm sure many of you, especially if you're a female watching this video, are like, that's bullshit. Like, of course we know, like we can pick it apart academically and be of course we know that. But society-wise, like it's still definitely a thing. Now, I've said this with quite a few things in this class. Like we could say, yeah, sure, that's how it used to be, but I feel like, times are changing. Like that's true. Times are changing. They will probably continue to change. We will progress in some great ways. Hopefully, the sexism that exists continues to decrease. But, it seems it's like a very daunting thing, because you think, where we at as females and as feminists, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you're like, God, like it's barely changing. And sometimes it feels like it's getting worse, right? Oh my goodness. You see, this is like natural with like biology and culture, that you see like, it's like the pendulum swinging, like it goes a little bit in one direction. Like, I think we're trending towards, it getting better, but, okay. Slide 25. Okay, slide 25. So I just have some pictures showing some like traditional female activities, especially in terms of like caring for offspring. You can see how literally often the female the baby has to be attached to her for ease for breastfeeding. Also, if the baby is small and helpless, the mother can't just like, I'm going to set you down on the ground and then I'm just going to be gone for like a couple hours. So the baby, especially in terms of like thinking ancestrally, or even with modern groups, that's highly dangerous, right? And then, of course, like food preparation. And slide 26, we see, males tending to do these more in general. We see, traditional male roles, so hunting, obviously, and things that require a lot more like upper body strength. I had a friend who, this was a couple years ago, we worked in construction, and I asked him, I was like, do you have any females who work in construction? Like, it popped into my mind one day. He's like, we have like one. And I was like, that's interesting. And he's like, what do you mean? I was like, that makes sense. Like, because we were talking about this, how like certain fields tend to be more male dominated and certain other fields tend to be female dominated. But in terms of when you actually have to have upper body strength, obviously we know like females, we're not like all like weak, but compared to two males of even around the same size, like my boyfriend is the same height as me, and I'm way a little less than him, but not much. But like he could probably lift 3 times what I can lift. I'm just as a female, I don't have that upper body strength. When it comes to other things, like I said before, hand-eye coordination or balance and stuff, leg strength, I can do a little bit better. But anyway, so I'd asked this friend about it. He said, yeah, we have this one female, and she's great, and but that makes sense in terms of like what I'm saying, that you're going to see that there's going to be overlap in that. There's going to be overlap, even in things like in biological things like that. So it's interesting. Okay, slide 27. Why are there sex-specific duties? So I already kind of talked about that. It's, but I think I have some answers on the next slide. So getting into what I was already saying in a little more detail. So go to slide 28. So here I go into more detail. This is important. There are 2 main reasons for the the way I've worded this sounds not right. It's like sex specialization. I meant like the role, the specialized roles, not, okay. There are two main reasons. So one, I already talked about offspring care. So because the females like literally have to have the babies attached to their bodies for extended periods of time, this is obviously going to be a factor in her decision of when she can leave, if she can leave, like a settled area. It might be a lot easier if like your camp is located in one location and you as a female, you have a baby here and a toddler here. We can wander for, a quarter of a mile in any direction to gather some berries. Oh, I caught a small rabbit. Okay, that's fine. But going any farther with small children is going to be much more difficult. I already kind of talked about that. So it's easier to kind of stay closer to the home. Now, we have kind of extended that idea. So even in modern populations, we think in terms of like, oh, there's like housewife who stays home with the kids. But there's a lot more, like I said, a lot more culturally what's the word I'm thinking of? A lot more culture we pile onto it, a lot more meaning and sexism we pile onto it that's not innate. There might be some innateness in that basic idea of, yes, of course, females breastfeed. That's a factor they have to consider. To suddenly now women aren't allowed to go get a college education. You know what I mean? So like, we always take it too far. And then the second one, something. Expendability. So we say in anthropology, men are expendable. And basically what this means is like thinking in terms of evolutionarily, men are expendable. How do I word this? Well, I think I said it in the first bullet point. Women are more reproductively valuable. You can, in terms of reproduction, where do I start? Well, number one, if you think about how humans create offspring, it has to be a male and a female. We talked about this earlier in the semester with, alleles and chromosomes and all that, mitosis, meiosis. There's that, initial conception, but to go from that point to an actual birthed human, there's a whole process that is 100% on the female, not on the male. He only really has to be around for a couple minutes, and the female basically takes on all of that other biological, anatomical, emotional, hormonal responsibility for gestation and childbirth and breastfeeding and most of the child care after that. So it's a huge responsibility. But thinking, as a woman in the world, it's a huge responsibility. But also thinking in terms of evolution, that for females, we have this, we know this, we understand this about ourselves, which is why what we tend to see, females tend to engage they're less likely to engage in risky behavior. They're more likely to pick partners who, they're more likely to be a little more picky about their sexual partners or potential mates, versus males tend to not be as much. Because males can, a female, she's like, okay, if I'm gonna dedicate all of this time and energy and resources into having offspring, and then all the years after, that's a dedication. The person I pick, because I can't just do it all the time. It's like a whole process, right? When I decide to do it, this is what she's thinking. When I decide to do it, it has to be a person of quality, either genetically or emotionally, whatever the case may be. But for males, because they don't really have to be around that very long, and they could literally impregnate 100 women in 100 days, and by chance alone, a handful of them are going to survive and thrive, and they'll be able to pass down their genes. But for females, it's not the same. There's so much more that goes into it. She can't just get it pregnant once a day. You know what I mean? There's a year, with all this stuff included, probably. So like I said before, they tend to be more reproductively valuable in that. And men are a little more expendable. They can only be around for a certain amount of time for the actual conception event. But also, once the ones that are there for that, they could die and they could still pass on their genes without a problem. For the female, that can't happen. She has to be able to obviously, like, gestate the fetus, birth, go through childbirth, breastfeed, childcare, and to ensure that, okay, hopefully this child's going to survive so she can pass down her genes. Thinking in terms of these evolutionary ideas. So I hope this is making sense to you, that the strategies for males and females in terms of like sex, mate choice, how often and with whom and when they choose to mate are going to be quite different for males and females. And this kind of like I said before, these are like evolutionary facts. But then we pile on a bunch of other cultural bullshit on top of it. And suddenly this is why we see these very sexist views about male and female sexuality. And like their, what's the word I'm thinking of? Sexual behavior. And so we start to see more restrictions on females, less restrictions on males, because a lot of this stuff, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, because we're going to talk about this in another PowerPoint, but just kind of keep these ideas in mind about the sex differences, evolutionarily, anatomically, biologically, these things that are factual, and how we often pile on a lot of like other cultural and social rules and regulations on top of that. Okay. Slide 29. Age specialization. So whether you're a child or an adult, or whether you're older, there are going to be certain roles in the community that you will have a responsibility to. And that's like, if you are a hunter-gatherer, you might at a very young age be learning how to hunt, be learning how to gather. And even we would say, like, even in, like, let's say Las Vegas 2020, children, we think, okay, they're going to play and they're going to go to school. But we also, typically what you see is that, families will designate, like, they have certain chores that they have to learn. Obviously, when you are, like, an adult, you are kind of at your peak, like, strength and knowledge, a really good balance of, like, strength and knowledge. You have, the energy, and some of the knowledge. And then, of course, as you're older, you might have a lot more knowledge, but maybe not the physical strength that you used to. So the jobs and tasks that you might have in your community will be different. So just kind of think of that in terms, and I have some slides, I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but one for children, one for adults, and one for if you're a bit older, that the roles or responsibilities in your community will be different. Whether you're hunter-gatherer, whether you're in our agricultural society, whether it's 10,000 years ago or now, that they're going to be different based on your age. Okay. So that's it for this one, and I will see you guys on the next one.